Massive spoiler warning for Xenoblade Chronicles 3, its DLC story Future Redeemed, and, the entirety of Star Wars. Darth Vader is the most iconic villain of all time because he embodies just about everything a fantastic villain needs. And N from Xenoblade 3 has an insane amount of similarities to him. No, seriously, when I tell you these two are like virtually the same character, I mean, George Lucas himself might as well have been like, sure, you can copy my homework, just change it up a little so it's not too obvious. It's because of these crazy similarities that by the end of this video, I'm pretty confident I will have convinced you that N deserves the title of all-time best villain in the Xenoblade Chronicles series. Let's take a look at some of the surface level stuff first, because I'm gonna be honest with you, it gets pretty freaky after that. The first time the public ever saw Darth Vader was in what is now called Episode 4, A New Hope. All we knew as the audience at the time is that he's a bad guy who is either a robot or a man in a suit or both, but the most obvious thing that stuck out about him was his mask. Or robot head, maybe? Either way, it was a very unique design that was both mysterious yet menacing at the same time. Just his mask alone has quite a bit of similarities to N's, believe it or not, despite looking nothing like it, but we'll get to that in just a bit. Not only did Vader have a dominating presence on screen when he first stepped onto that rebel ship, but you were immediately intrigued because he starkly contrasted everything around him. The ship, the rebels, even his own men, the stormtroopers. So naturally, there was a ton of mystery surrounding him. Similarly, when we first see N, we have no idea who he is. This is mostly because his face is hidden, but the reason behind this was most likely because the writers wanted that same mystery to surround him, much like Vader. Of course, when we eventually see a clear front shot of him, we know he also wears a mask. He's also dressed pretty oddly, so kind of like Vader, he sticks out like a sore thumb from all the other characters, including all of the other evil Mobius. Well, except Zed. His suit even gives off a bit of those cyborg vibes similar to Vader, and he has the same type of dominating presence as him. In the case of both Vader and N, their respective creators gave us just enough information for us to know these villains mean business, with the intention of giving the audience this natural desire to want to know more about them. And wouldn't you know, we learn about their true identity very similarly too. But I'm getting ahead of myself. First, we need to talk about how these two very different looking masks relate to each other. While we eventually learn that Vader wears a mask first and foremost because it provides him life support, the reason for N wearing a mask is a bit more of a mystery. And for those of you saying, it's to hide his identity! Come on, do you really think the same community that's suspicious of Riku being a freaking god didn't know N was Noah from the start? No, I think the developers had a different intention in mind. Aside from looking cool, I think N's mask is a representation of his shame. He's hiding behind it. Don't get me wrong, N would never admit this, as every villain, including the very one we are comparing him to, thinks that what they are aiming to achieve is right or just. They might be doing some things they know are wrong to get there, but they're all about that goal. However, deep down, these heroes turned villain turned hero again always have this internal struggle that leaves the good part of them asking, what am I doing? The evil part of them just shoves that rationale back down with excuses they've made up to justify what they're doing. And trust me, there's so much more to dissect about that I'll get to closer to the end. But with all of this in mind, N knows deep down what he's doing is wrong, but he ignores it. His mask is a symbolic representation of his good self hiding behind this facade that everything's okay. He is, in a way, ashamed. This is extremely similar to Vader. Of course, his helmet and entire suit served multiple purposes, such as to look menacing and even to give a certain mystery about him to both other characters and the audience, but you can't tell me that this man who eventually turns back to the light side doesn't feel comfort in hiding behind a mask because of the shame he feels deep down for what he has become. Which leads me to the most obvious parallel between Vader and N, that yes, both of these characters are heroes turned to villains, and back again. But that's just the start, so put on your salvager outfits cause this is where we dive deep.
Rule 5 of the Salvage Code.
Darth Vader, formerly known as Anakin Skywalker, was born into slavery. N, or Noah, at the point that we find him in Xenoblade 3, has been reborn countless times into a cycle of what one could consider slavery. He is a slave to the flame clock and must kill others to extend his life, he just doesn't know it until later. After Anakin fulfills his lifelong dream of becoming a Jedi years down the line, he is eventually faced with a choice given to him by a greater evil. In Anakin's case, it was Palpatine. In N's case, it was Zed. However, the choices they are given are extremely similar and are born from the exact same desire. Palpatine gives Anakin the choice of either saving the one he loves most, his wife Padme, but forsaking everyone else and his ideals in the process, or the choice of letting her die. N is given the choice of living with Mio literally forever in the endless now, or letting her die. We know that they both ended up making the decision to save their true love, and they both became slaves to their decision, much like they had been their whole lives prior. But the motivation behind these two and their choices is what's even more interesting to me, and it surprisingly has nothing to do with love. Both of the choices that these two men made were born out of something that will control anyone's life if left unchecked. Fear. As Master Yoda said to Anakin when he was just a boy, fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering. Sound familiar? This fear of loss is something that haunts both Anakin and Noah to the point that they are willing to forsake everything out of a selfish desire to remain with the one they love forever. That same fear eventually leads our villains to anger and hate, which caused them to bury their emotions and even morals to kill others, and it eventually led to the most antagonizing thing of all: suffering. Suffering not because they eventually lost the ones they loved, though that's part of it, but suffering primarily because of what their choice cost them, and because when the good left in them realized what it cost them, it was already too late. They were trapped. For Anakin, he had nothing to go back to. He destroyed it all, and the only path forward seemed to be the one he had doomed himself to. For Noah, it was similar. He had already killed his son, and his grandchildren hated him. All of this alone would be evidence enough to prove to me that N is the best Xenoblade villain, but it gets even crazier from here. We know that Vader and N eventually turned back to good, which brings me to the next set of parallels, which is that there was always good in them. I know it sounds pretty surface level, but trust me, it goes much deeper than that. Just wait for it. For Anakin, we got to see him as a kind little kid, then as a Jedi Knight, a mentor, and even a caring friend to many before he turned. And all throughout his journey, we realized that he was and always remained a good person, at least deep down when he was Vader. He genuinely cared for others and wanted to do the right thing. And of course, this made his downfall that much more tragic, but it also gave the viewer hope that one day he could turn back to the light side. Padme even stated to Obi-Wan right before she died that there was good in him even after he had turned to the dark side. Even though we didn't see too much of specifically N's backstory, we did get to play through Noah's story, who is of course just another version of him that, just made better choices. From this we can deduce pretty much the same thing as we could for Anakin, that he was truly a good person who cared for others and wanted what's best for everyone. Sure, like Anakin, he's still a flawed character, but one of the biggest issues for him is that he realizes there is something inherently wrong with taking other people's lives. Here's where the deeper Star Wars lore comes into play. I told you it was coming. In a TV show called Star Wars Rebels, a spiritual successor to the greatest piece of Star Wars media to date, I might add, we get to see Vader face off against his former apprentice, Ahsoka Tano, a fight that so many people had been dying to see for years, but that's beside the point. During this fight, Ahsoka eventually catches Vader off guard for a split second and cracks his mask, which is almost like a slap in the face to him. A realization, if you will. What we hear at first is a mixture of Anakin and Vader's voice saying Ahsoka a couple times, with Anakin's voice just barely coming through to Ahsoka. The third thing we get to hear him say is very clearly in Anakin's voice, indicating that it is indeed him talking to her. But what's important here is that for a split second you get to see in his eyes the slightest bit of hesitation, as Anakin Skywalker gets to see with his own eyes his apprentice, which represents his failure quite completely. She represents his failure because she has become everything he wanted to become himself, and he can't bear to even look at her. In the words of the director himself,
it's actually the fact that he sees her face to face, eye to eye, that Anakin Skywalker will retreat deep within Darth Vader.
Vader then attempts to kill Ahsoka since he wants to rid himself of any reminder of his failure. Anakin means to deny and run from his failure. I think you see where I'm going with this. Toward the end of Future Redeemed, we see Matthew does something similar to N that Ahsoka did to Vader. After a fight with Matthew and the gang on Prison Island, we get a better glimpse of what happened on the day that N destroyed the city. But instead of admitting he was wrong to kill everyone, N starts making excuses and even claims that it was Matthew's granddad's choice to be killed by him. Then he quite literally punches him in the face. What does N do? He just sits there. No retaliation or really any response whatsoever. Perhaps he's sitting there in contemplation or even hesitation like Vader. He knows deep down that Matthew is right and what he's doing is wrong. Either way, he gets some sense slapped into him because Matthew represents his failure as well as Gondor did. They both belong to his family that he was never a part of because of his choices. Yes, N does side with Matthew and the gang for a bit when he helps them face off against Alpha, but notice what he says right after he frees Niel. Don't mistake me. I am the one who lives in the now. My blade knows no regrets. Which implies that he is far from being turned back to good. They merely have a common enemy who threatens N's goals. Just like with Vader, in that moment of realization when Matthew punched him in the face, the good part of him, Noah, retreated right back into N. Similarly, neither of them have turned back to good at those points in their respective stories, yet it has been revealed to the audience that there is still good in them. Conflict, if you will. This is backed up by N stating after their fight with Alpha that Mobius will never change, which of course includes himself. I also find it cool that in both cases, the pieces of media showing Vader and N turning back to good, Return of the Jedi and Xenoblade 3 respectively, released prior to these two instances of showing there is still good in them, Rebels and Future Redeemed respectively, regardless of the fact that they chronologically come first. Other than the point in the game where Mio dies, which breaks N just as Padme dying broke Vader, it's pretty much business as usual for N up until the end of the game. And that's where the next parallel comes in. Much like Vader's son is the only one who is able to turn him back to the light side, only someone of N's own flesh and blood, quite literally his own flesh and blood, is able to turn him back to the good side. Now, of course, for the sake of this video, it would have been perfect for N's son Gondor to have been the one to turn him back to the good side like we see with Vader's son, but I'm actually glad this isn't the case because I don't want to copy and paste story. Regardless, after both Vader and N turn back to Anakin and Noah respectively, what do? They kill the big baddie that turned them to evil in the first place. And wouldn't you know, it kills both of them in the process. Of course, there's more to both instances, such as N's good half Noah living on, Mio being thrown into the mix, and even the fact that Noah's bad side, which symbolically has always been a part of him, is destroying the very evil that he embodies. Now, I know what you might be thinking. This is all just a coincidence. Well, I thought so too at first, but then I did a little digging and found out that the Xenoblade Chronicles series was actually influenced by Star Wars. In an Iwata Asks interview, the late Satoru Iwata asks Xenoblade series director Tetsuya Takahashi about what influenced him, and wouldn't you know, Star Wars was one of those things. And seeing as Star Wars got much of its inspiration from Japanese culture, which, surprise surprise, is where the Xeno series was made, it makes sense that Xenoblade took inspiration from Star Wars in more ways than you might think. So yeah, I think it's safe to say that many, if not all of the similarities between these two characters were intentional. But anyway, did I convince you that N is the greatest villain in Xenoblade history? Or do I need to
rewind our clocks back to the start?
We're getting pretty close to that 1,000 subscriber mark, so if you enjoy content like this, consider subscribing so we can reach that goal by the end of this year. And as always, thanks for watching till the end.